Hello, and welcome to our podcast,
Sisters, Not Wives.
I'm your host, Kinsley Hatch.
And I'm Jocelyn Hatch.
A podcast dedicated to looking at the history and repercussions of Mormon polygamy from female perspectives.
We are creating this podcast for the people who have felt lost when it comes to the history of the church, and by that I mean the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, whatever you want to call it. For me personally, I know when I first started looking at these things and finding out more of like the history of the church and things people don't really want to talk about, I felt so alone when I found it and when I was looking for answers. I felt like I was either told to shut up and forget about it or to leave the things that I loved. I hated how I was told I could ask questions when really that just meant I should only ask the easy questions that didn't address anything I was feeling or truly worried about. I was told just to have faith and to put things on the shelf, even though those things were against my moral compass and were just straight up illogical. I also didn't like the polarization of throwing out everything that I had been taught because there were things that didn't sit right with me. I have had so many experiences that have filled me with light and shaped who I am directly because of how I was raised and the principles that I learned and lived inside the church. I eventually have made my own spiritual and religious choices, which are personal and evolving. And for me, I've personally chosen to stay in the church. But there is still an urgent need in my mind to find answers to hard questions. I didn't want to just be told what to think, feel, and what answers were right. I wanted to know for myself, and so I started researching. Knowledge is power. That's one of my core beliefs. And since I got my degree in history, I knew how to dig deeper than just believing what different narratives said. In history, there's a hierarchy of legitimacy based on the type of source a story is based on. Primary, secondary, and tertiary sources all have their places in the telling of history, but they also have their own limitations. The history of the church is especially a very messy topic because from the beginning till now, there have been different groups of people trying to control the narrative for their own motivations. As I researched the actual sources, who these people were, what they were actually saying, and the physical evidence to back up their words, how the stories have evolved over time, I was honestly shocked. I found that the primary sources told a very different story than the ones we are familiar with, and the truth is far more complicated, darker, and hidden than you may think. That some of the most truthful and powerful voices have been suffocated throughout the years, and there is much of the truth missing from the story because of it. We are not here to tell you what to believe on a religious or spiritual basis one way or the other. What we are here to do is tell the stories of the voices from the past who were suppressed for power and gain, to show you the history and the sources, and to lead from a place of logic backed up by historical facts instead of only authority or heightened emotion. From these evidences, we hope you make your own choices based on thinking for yourself and holding fast to what is true and right and good, regardless of the powers that be. So, let's get into it. There are many topics we're going to go over surrounding the history of Mormonism, but I wanted to start with one of the most controversial because that sounds fun.
Start off with a bang.
Yeah. So that topic is polygamy, and it is a pretty crazy topic. A ton of people have left the church over what they have discovered about polygamy, especially when they dive into the details of it. And even with many people who know about polygamy, I mean, everyone knows about polygamy, but people who have chosen to stay in the church, even this topic, anyone who stays, it still makes them feel pretty uncomfy. It's not a really fun topic to talk about, and a lot of times it gets pushed under the rug for a reason. So yeah, that's what I thought would be great to start with. And I just want to ask you, do you remember any of your first experiences when you first heard about polygamy?
I think being in the church is kind of interesting just because when you're raised in the church, and hearing about polygamy, just because when you're a kid, I don't feel like you really totally grasp the concept. I feel like when I first heard it, I was like, I don't even know how old I was, but I was like, that's weird. But you don't fully understand the concept of the sexual element, the just everything. And so I don't think I really, and again, it is one of those things that it's very taboo in the church, and it's not, people don't love to talk about it.
Right.
And so I don't think that I really remember a defining moment until later in adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like it is just something that's mentioned and we're like we know about it, but a lot of the times it doesn't really hit us until much later. And then we're like, wait, or we're like, what?
Yeah.
And I feel like that generally happens either as like a teenager or an adult when you start thinking about like putting two and two together.
Yeah. I feel like I started to think about it when I started dating somebody, and I really liked him. And then one day he asked me if I would be one of his wives.
Yeah.
And I was like,
What?
I thought he was joking. And so I started laughing, and then he was just stone faced, and I was like, what? Excuse me?
What the heck?
Yeah, that he was very serious about it, and I was like, ooh. But I like didn't know how to take it. It was like almost so shocking that I was like, what? And proceeded to go on this rant about how there's so many good women in the world and not enough good men to take care of them.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That is crazy. But he wasn't like a part of a polygamous community or something.
No, he was just like a normal member in the church going through a divorce. He was like, maybe next time.
Oh my
Maybe I'll
gosh.
get me 5 of these wives or something.
That way it'll be okay if one of them leaves.
Yeah, you would think that I would have heard that and been like, goodbye.
Right.
But no,
Well,
I just thought, I could fix him.
sometimes it be like that. Sometimes.
And then I was so shocked when I found out that he was playing me and 2 other girls.
Well, he did tell you.
You did tell me.
And he did offer to you.
Yes.
Maybe he thought you took the offer. But yeah, that is straight up crazy. Like, I feel like it's pretty normal in society, like hookup culture or to want to be with multiple people and things like that. But it's interesting to take it from a religious perspective, especially like Christian, like American Christian religions. They're like kind of the last stand for nowadays for like monogamy and the quote unquote traditional family unit and things like that. So it's interesting when it comes in that context. Because yeah, that's crazy. I know for me, my first experience with polygamy, I can't remember how old I was. I think I was like 8, but I remember like thinking about it and I was like, that don't seem right. Like, I don't understand that at all. And so I went to my mom, our mom, and I was like, hey,
Mother.
Mom, yes, can you explain polygamy to me? I don't get it at all. It doesn't like, can you please tell me why that happened? And she was like, ooh, like, she didn't really know herself.
I mean, who does?
That's the thing. It's like, yeah, how do you explain that to a child? And especially when you yourself in the church, you're told not to question. Anyway, so she was like, you know what? I don't really know the answer to that, but there is a guy in our ward. He's like an older guy who wrote a bunch of like church history books and had a lot of background with that and BYU and things like that. So she's like, go ask him. I'm sure he has something. He can explain it to you. So the next week I like bebop my way over to him at church. I'm like, brother, blah, blah, blah. Can you explain polygamy to me? I don't get it. And he tells me, he's like, you know what, Kensley? You shouldn't be concerned about polygamy. And you know why? And I was like, what? And he's like, because your family is late to church every single week. Which was true.
Yeah, not wrong.
And he's like, you should focus more on that instead of polygamy.
Or getting your family to church on time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I was just like, screw you. Like, even as a kid, I was offended. I was like, that was rude.
Well, also, yeah, we might have been late, but we freaking wait every single week. We never skipped a week unless somebody was like sick or something. So just had to throw that in there.
I know. So rude. Anyways, that was my first experience with polygamy. And I was like, okay, rude. And I kind of lost some respect for him. But then I was like, well, there goes the person who knew the answer. Now I'm back to square one. So that was my first experience. But the funny thing is, I just kind of gave up at that point. I was like, well, that didn't work. But that obviously stuck with me because of that crazy experience with that guy. But kind of like what we were saying in earlier, it's interesting nowadays because the church is so like, and I keep saying the church, like the LDS church, the Mormon church, whatever, but it is so monogamous now. The proclamation to the family and everything, like general conference talks, they emphasize that a lot right now. And sometimes they get a lot of heat for it. So it's interesting that there's still remnants of polygamy in the church today. Like, obviously we have the history of it that you can't erase, but it's weird that there's still things in the church that have to do with polygamy that are still like active and going. Like, for instance, polygamy in heaven. Like, according to the current theology that's preached, there will be polygamy in heaven. It's interesting. Like, that's
So weird.
Because men can still be sealed to multiple women in the temple today. Obviously, back then with Brigham Young and like 1800s and stuff, that was happening. But today, like, men, and the interesting thing is, it's exactly the same way that it was back then, where men can do it, but women can't. So men can be sealed to multiple women. It's not like living, not active anymore, but like if a man in the church gets divorced or their spouse dies or something like that, then they can remarry and then get sealed to that person. But in the same situation, a woman cannot do that. If she is sealed to her first husband and they divorce or death or something like that, and she remarries, it has to stay a civil marriage, and she cannot get sealed to this husband, her current husband, in the temple because she's already sealed to her first husband. So she has to get a temple divorce from her first husband in order to be sealed to one, because she only gets one.
That's so wild.
It is crazy. It's very interesting. So that still is an active part of the church. And it kind of gets weird because even in like church records, no matter what, like legally it is, a woman's last name in the church, even if she divorces her husband, still stays her husband's name unless she gets approval from the first presidency to change it in the church records. So even that is something you have to get approval from the first presidency. And this whole approval from the first presidency also stems to polygamy times and Brigham Young and like how it was set up back then. So it's interesting that that is still an active part of the church today. And another big thing that's interesting is section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is the revelation about polygamy. That's still a part of Doctrine and Covenants as a revelation. Obviously, they eventually said polygamy is not what we're doing anymore, and there was a declaration years later. But this is still like studied in Sunday school and still a part of the scriptures. So I do find all that like super interesting.
I feel like that's one of those topics too that gets talked about quite a bit, and people are concerned with that one. Like, you hear women that get divorced all the time that are like, I don't want to be sealed to him. And then it's kind of the same thing where it gets brushed under the rug. Like, I've heard people that have gone to their bishops or their stake presidents with that concern, and then they're like, you know what? Everything will work itself out in the end.
That is so true.
And it's like, well, then why is it? I don't know.
Right. And it is super. And even people, like even kids from divorced families get like kind of shook up about this because they're like, in the afterlife, like, who am I going to be with? And it's kind of told the same thing. Like, everything will be made right in the end. And I do believe that. Like, I believe God is good and fair and everything. And so, but
it's just kind of weird that that's the principle or the doctrine then.
It's,
like, why does it have to be? I don't know.
It is weird. It's like, it just makes people in those situations question, because it's like, they're told that, but the doctrine is this. And the doctrine is pretty clear and straightforward, and like it's said. And so
I think the other weird thing about that too is we're taught all the time. I think whether you're in the LDS church or any other church, that it, when you die, you don't take your money and your possessions, you take your relationships.
Yes.
So it's weird that it's like, yeah, but up here, they still gotta follow these rules.
For sure. And like the LDS church places so much emphasis on the temple. And so that is why a lot of people are really concerned about it, because all their lives they've been told it's the most important thing, and like families are forever. And of course you would be concerned about being with your family. Like it makes sense, but it's just interesting that questions like these are brought up because of that, and how polygamy kind of plays a little role in that. But yeah, so I think it would kind of be good just to start out in this discussion, just kind of going over the official narrative of polygamy from the church standpoint, and then where that differs when it comes to like anti-Mormon, quote unquote, like sources, like people who are not in the church, who don't agree, who like actively promote things against it.
Tell me everything. Yeah.
So the narrative told by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, you can look it up on their website, about the narrative of polygamy is that Joseph Smith had a revelation on July 12th, 1843, which was a little less than a year before he was killed. He was killed in June 1844. And this revelation was a commandment by God to practice polygamy. This was the official doctrine of polygamy, and it is section 132 in Doctrine and Covenants, which is still in our scriptures today. However, it is believed, and the section's chapter summary even says this, that the principles of polygamy were revealed to Joseph Smith much earlier than this, even as early as 1831. So potentially 12 years earlier than the official doctrine, or the official revelation was revealed.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that's what they say. And the narrative goes that Joseph Smith was told way back then, like in 1831, around there, to start practicing polygamy by God. But Joseph was already married to Emma Smith at this time, and he struggles with the commandment over the years because of her. Sometimes he tries it out and tries practicing polygamy and takes multiple wives, but then stops for a while because Emma gets mad. And there's different times where they say, oh, Emma consented to it, but then she couldn't handle it and got mad and kicked them all out. Or sometimes it says he was doing it behind her back.
That's what it says in the church documents?
That's what the church says.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. This supposedly goes on for like 12 years, if it started in 1831, until God has had enough. He's like, enough fooling around. I told you what to do, and you're not doing it. And so...
You know how God does.
Yeah. He's like, I'll give him 12 years. If he doesn't figure it out by then, I'm going to do something.
He's checking his watch.
Yeah. Anyway, so this is when an angel with a flaming sword, and this is what the church says. Again, just reiterating, this is not like something I found on Reddit. So they say an angel came down to Joseph Smith with holding a freaking flaming sword. And the angel was like, Joseph? We've told you and told you and told you to start practicing polygamy, that it's the celestial law of marriage, that God wants you to do it. And as the prophet of the Lord, you need to be the one to start this. And you haven't. And that is very disobedient of you.
Oh my God.
And he's
an
like,
angel with a flaming sword.
Yes, not
That's
even a normal angel.
Yeah, not even a normal sword.
Yeah,
a flaming sword?
A normal sword would have cut it. No pun intended. Oh gosh, my dad. See if he did. But for real, he's like, my sword is freaking on fire right now because you are doing what you're supposed to do.
Look how mad my sword is.
Yeah.
I'm going to stab you and burn you.
Yeah. Oh gosh. It is pretty dramatic.
Now, why can't an angel with a flaming sword ever come to me when I'm making a bad decision?
I guess it's not bad enough.
Man, I'm going to start making some worse decisions.
I know. It's like, well, an angel with a flaming sword hasn't showed up yet, so I think I'm pretty good right now.
Right. Well, that must be okay.
Yeah, it's like not even his buddy Moroni could come down and be like,
yeah, why don't you have his friend go talk to him?
Yeah.
Jeez Louise.
I think maybe because the story goes that he had and he wouldn't listen. So it's like, it's gotta get
some tough love.
Yeah. So the angel,
some violence up in there.
Yes. So and it's crazy what they say the angel told him. which was, Joseph Smith, you get to start practicing polygamy now. Stop messing around. Obey the commandment. Otherwise, God will destroy you.
Jeez.
And so this is where it like gets real for Joseph Smith. And he's like, man, I got to, you know?
Get to marrying and get to screwing. Sorry.
The nerve.
I had to.
The angel didn't say anything about that.
It was implied.
And the church doesn't see it that way. Like, the church does not look at it from a sexual standpoint.
But isn't that the whole principle of the matter? Was to like replenish and populate the church?
That's the interesting thing. There's like different arguments for why polygamy had to happen. And one of them is like your posterity and expanding the offspring in the church. And also like, and this comes more from the days of Brigham Young, of like expanding your kingdom in the afterlife. Like, have as many wives and have as many children as you can, because they're all going to bring glory to you in the afterlife and expand your kingdom. So that was a really big thing for Brigham Young that he preached. But we don't really see a lot of that from Joseph Smith.
That's so weird.
Yeah. But
like
obviously,
quantity over quality?
Yes, 100%.
So that they can praise you. It sounds very egotistical.
I mean, yeah, that perspective is kind of like, I don't know, very property based and very much almost like medieval, you know, like have the biggest kingdom you can in the afterlife because you can, you know. But the church really does not emphasize that, like the official narrative. It's not because, but the church does say, like, yeah, one of the reasons is to bring have offspring, to bring them into the church. But at this point, they really like emphasize this being the celestial law that God had revealed, and they try to separate it from sexuality. And that's what is really different between like the anti-Mormon perspective versus the Mormon perspective and the claims too. Like, the church does not deny that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Different scholars argue about the number of wives he took and how many of them were his sexual partners. But that's one of the biggest differences between the church and people outside the church who argue about it, is the church says he had less sexual partners and less wives. And the people outside the church say the numbers are a lot bigger of how many wives he had and how sexual he was with these partners, how many of them he was sexual with. Because some of them were just sealings and it wasn't like an earthly marriage and there wasn't supposed to be relations with them. And so there's a lot of argument about like the degrees of the polygamy that Joseph Smith started. So that's kind of a big difference between those two. But no one argues, the church or people outside the church, no one argues that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy and didn't have sexual partners outside of Emma and didn't have marriages and relationships outside of Emma Smith. Both of them agree that happened, which is kind of crazy that the church accepts that and believes that and preaches that was not only okay, but ordained by God. Yeah. And I think that's why it makes a lot of people uncomfy inside the church, is it just doesn't seem super right. It doesn't make sense. Yeah. And so...
yeah, it's like they're just disputing the numbers and that whatever. It's like that really... I don't know.
Right.
Makes that much of a difference.
And the numbers aren't like, oh, he had 2 wives, and anti-Mormons are saying, no, he had 60. It's like, the church is like, he had like between like 12 and 25. And the Mormons, the like outside people are saying he had like 25 to 40 or something like that. That's so like bizarre. The church still, it's not like it's like, oh, he only had 1 extra wife. It's like, they're like, he had like 12 or 25.
Just a few.
It's interesting.
It's like a dozen.
Yeah.
Maybe double that.
We don't know. It depends on the sources. But it's interesting. It's like, why, if it was ordained by God and it was right and good, which is what the church says it was at the time. They don't preach that it's like right and good to do that now, but they say with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all those people, it was right and good and ordained by God. And Joseph Smith didn't even want to do it, but God told him he did, and he struggled with it for a long time, and that's why the whole flaming sword thing happened. Like, they still preach that. So it's like, why, if you believe that, do you try to, like, make it less? Like, why do you try to dispute that he only had 15 wives or something like that? You know, like, if it's right and good, why does it matter?
Yeah.
And I guess the thing is just like accuracy, historical accuracy. You know, like, you look at the sources, and that's what we're going to do too, is look at the sources, because historical accuracy is important. And so there's that, which I do understand. But like, from a moral perspective, 12 wives versus 30, like, doesn't seem like there's that much moral parallel there. But from a historical accuracy point, just arguing the sources, like, I get that. But it's just interesting that it's more like a historical accuracy question as opposed to a moral question. Like, morally, the church and people outside the church, like, disagree super strongly, but they both say the same thing happened.
It's almost like they're getting caught up on that part of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well,
You're like, no, you're wrong. It is less. And that somehow makes it better.
Yes. It kind of seems like beating around the bush, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, but that still doesn't ask the pressing questions of, like, why did God say this was okay? And is it okay? Is it ever, you know, like, these are like really philosophical questions and really deep questions, and really kind of like ground shaking questions if you ask them, and you know historically that your prophets did these things and your people did these things. And so they're a lot harder to answer. And so I think it's easier to argue about the numbers and argue about, like, the details like that. Because, I mean, that was one thing I really struggle with. It's hard to get a straight answer about this from people still in the church. A lot of times they're like, well, like, I literally had a bishop in New York tell me, well, do you believe in the Book of Mormon? And I was like, yes. And he's like, well, that's all you need to know. That's it. Like, you don't need a question about polygamy and Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. If you know the Book of Mormon is true, just hold on to that. And, like, I get the principle of faith. Like, you can't know every single thing about everything, but at the same time, you can know something that's pretty big to me. And just because I had faith doesn't mean I didn't want to know and didn't know that wasn't troubling me, you know?
Well, and I feel like a lot of times in the church too, they talk about, like, if you're unsure about something, if you're unsure about this, like, pray about it or seek the answers for yourself. I don't know. And I guess it's like they only want that to apply to the Book of Mormon in a weird way sometimes.
I mean, I think, and I really actually love this about the church, that it is that way. Like, other like, different sects handle different things differently. And by that kind of sounds like sex, but sect as in SECTS. Like, I do like how the church does have this, like, ask for yourself and know for yourself, and you can receive personal revelation. And that comes from a lot of teachings of Joseph Smith. Like, you can know for yourself. Like, that's his whole origin story of the first vision, and like, everything he was looking for answers for himself. But I think that's kind of the contradiction, is like, the church, like, tells you that, but then, I mean, it's like, okay, well, what if I get a different answer? Like, the church just kind of says, well, if you don't get the answer that we say you should
that's
get,
from the devil.
Yeah, that's probably not personal revelation, and it's probably motivated by, like, you want to be bad, or you want to party, or you're not clear, or you've strayed, and so you can't receive personal revelation because you're in a dark place. And so, yeah. So I feel like that's a really big part of it, but...
Double-edged flaming sword.
I love it. Yeah. Another thing is that the church says that's interesting about polygamy is they say there were times where Joseph Smith and other people were lying about it, saying publicly that they were not practicing polygamy, but privately, they were teaching people polygamy. They were being married to women. They were teaching others to practice polygamy. And the church justifies it with Joseph Smith in particular, saying, well, he had to because Emma was going to get angry if he didn't lie to her. Which is like, yeah, that's how marriages work. Like, right. But the answer is not like, oh, I'm doing something that my spouse doesn't like. Well, guess I have to lie and be sneaky. That's the right thing to do. If she would just let me, I wouldn't have to lie. It's like, but they use that as justification. Like, Emma could not, like, bear what God was telling them. And so he had to sneak. And
you sneaky little.
Yeah. But it kind of like, it's interesting. It's like, what's more important? And this is kind of how the church takes it. Like, what's more important? God, all knowing, all wise, all like present God, or what your wife says? And so they make that kind of parallel. And so, like, as a religious person, we are taught like God always comes first and then family. And so in that aspect, that's how they view it. Like, well, God told him, so that would trump what Emma wanted. And it's really interesting. I think nowadays they're trying to pull away from this narrative a little bit. But I remember for me as a kid, it was kind of like a side note of like, Emma was weak. Like Emma was kind of like high maintenance, like she couldn't handle
it.
Yeah, she couldn't handle the doctrine of polygamy. She didn't follow the Saints West. And it's kind of almost like pitying. Like she dealt with so much she couldn't follow the Saints West. But with polygamy, it was kind of like this was right and Emma was not strong enough to take it, which is so interesting.
I feel like it's the opposite.
Yeah,
to have a strong opinion and to kind of stick to your guns as a woman at this time frame.
For sure. And that's what I love about Emma Smith is how strong she was. She was older than Joseph Smith. She was richer than Joseph Smith. And she eloped with Joseph Smith to get married. And her family was ticked. They did not want that to happen. But she was in love with Joseph Smith and she believed him. And she went through so many horrible things. We'll go into her story, but she stuck with him through it all. And so I'm glad they're pulling away from that narrative because that's not a fair representation of her at all. And when you get into the details of what happened, not only with her and Joseph Smith, but also what happened after his death and what remained of the church and the people she had to fight and the people who were fighting her and what they were trying to do to her, like, we'll get into it, but there's like...
That's me rubbing my hands together and it's like...
I know, it's crazy. It's things like her house got set on fire. Not once, not twice, multiple times after Joseph Smith died. Like, and it wasn't just like people who had killed Joseph Smith trying to get at her. It was other people who she was fighting against after Joseph Smith died about the church and about things going on. And like, it's crazy.
That's so awful.
It is.
There's something really evil about setting somebody's house on fire. Like their place of safety.
Yeah.
And you're not directly confronting them. You're just like, sorry. It's a whole side tangent. But it's
you're like arsonists, I just cannot get behind.
Not at all. Stabbers, different story. Just kidding.
Gosh.
I'm kidding.
You and the angel would get along.
I already want to know the guy.
Maybe not, though, because it was on fire. So.
Oh.
Double whammy.
Oh. Now I don't know. I'm having mixed feelings. Did they ever say which angel that was?
No, I don't think they ever
identified. It's just
an
anonymous angel.
It's just the angry angel. It's the angel who gets crap done.
Love that guy.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not, though. I don't know.
Well, he's never appeared.
I gotta work this out within myself.
Yeah, we'll see. But anyway, I digress. Yeah. So, and also another aspect for the sneakiness is polygamy was illegal. And so it's like they had to, otherwise Joseph Smith was going to get arrested.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
When were the Articles of Faith published?
Ooh, that's a good question. I have looked that up, but I don't know off the top of my head, so I would have to look. Why do you ask?
I just wonder because it was illegal, and in the one Article of Faith about following, kings, presidents, rulers, magistrates.
Right. That's what I do remember.
Unless
Unless what?
Unless you want to do polygamy and that's legal.
Right. That it does have a super big dichotomy between the thought processes. Because
Also, who wrote them?
Joseph Smith did. So
March 1st, 1842.
Okay, so around the same time that he would have had this revelation. A little bit before, actually, because the revelation was July 12th, 1843. So in March, he would have had this revelation, or had written the Articles of Faith. And the Articles of Faith origin is he wrote letters, like, I can't remember who he was writing, but someone asked him, like, what they believed in the church. And so he wrote this as a letter to him, and then they kept it and made it the Articles of Faith, because it was pretty good.
That was just a random side thought I've always thought about.
But that is a big topic that happens with polygamy in the start of the church, is like being good citizens and doing what God tells you to do. And in this time, like with polygamy and other things that happen with Brigham Young later, they come into conflict. But then there's other things where we try to obey the law. So it's really interesting how the church eventually, the early days of the church in Utah, how they eventually end up seeing the federal government and government authority in general, and how they see freedom and rights and all of that. And a lot of that also stems from that the early Mormons, the early pioneers felt like betrayed by the government.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they, like, literally the governor of Missouri wrote an extermination order for them.
Yeah.
Where they had been being persecuted and they had been trying to get help from the government, and their houses got burned down and their women got attacked and their men got killed.
And they got drove out of so many places.
So many places. They lost everything they made over and over and over again. So that kind of feeds into it too. Anyway, so this is kind of where the anti-Mormon narrative comes in. So that's the perspective of the church, is polygamy is not about the sexuality of it. It is about bringing children into the world and in populating the world and like helping the church grow, and with your own personal kingdom, helping that expand. But it wasn't about like the sex part of it. That was not the intention at all. And they used different claims for that. Like, oh, well, there was wives who they were, like Joseph Smith was sealed to, it wasn't even an earthly marriage, and they never had relations, like sexual relations. And so, like, obviously this was just a spiritual thing. So that's what they believe. And that's the narrative. And then the anti-Mormon, or the people outside the church, narrative is that, first of all, obviously the biggest one is they don't believe polygamy was ordained by God. They don't believe he had a revelation. A lot of people like don't believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, or revelations are a thing anyway. So, but polygamy, first of all, was not ordained by God, so you don't have that authority trump. And then that, like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and the people who followed, it was sexually motivated, and that was actually the primary motivation, was sex. And then the argument of like how many plural wives there were, how many sexual partners there were. And they really paint Joseph Smith as a pedophile, a sex addict, a liar. There is a case with Heber C. Kimball where Joseph Smith was sealed to his 14-year-old daughter. And so that's where the pedophile claims come from. Like, why on earth would he need to be sealed to a 14-year-old? And like, even outside of her, there's like 16 and 17-year-olds. And like Joseph Smith during the 1840s was like early 30s, late 20s. And so that's like obviously super strong claims that are very much against it. And we'll go into the sources of why people feel certain ways about that. But that's kind of the anti-Mormon perspective. The narrative of like how it happened and what happened is pretty similar. It just comes down to, was it right or was it wrong? And then the details of it. Like something else that gets anti-Mormons that they really don't like is there's a lot of claims that Joseph Smith married plural wives, like women who were already married to other men. And so like anti-Mormons see that as affairs. Whereas the church said, like, and it comes down to the sources. Like, some people are like, oh, no, that woman was already separated from her husband. But sometimes it's like, oh, yeah, that did happen during that time. But the husband had left the church. And so this was the only way she was going to get salvation. Yeah. So that's where the fighting kind of gets at. But regardless, a lot of the things that the like anti-Mormon narratives say are like deeply troubling, like claiming that the prophet is a pedophile and that he had teenagers who he married and had tons of sexual partners and was lying to Emma and married women and lying. Like all those things are like the icky things about polygamy that people fight about. And that's why sometimes I feel like people don't like talking about it, because it gets into kind of nasty topics.
And it was really messy, honestly.
Yeah.
It's interesting too when you were saying that, I don't know, just that they didn't do it like by the church's stance. It wasn't about the sexual aspect, and some of them weren't even like about having physical relationships. And I'm like, then why the frick would you want to marry so many women? Like, I feel like I don't know, that sounds like more of a problem to me than a good thing. But and then just what you're saying with Brigham Young's building up the kingdom theory, it's like I feel like there's definitely like little bits and pieces of everything that's just kind of like thrown in the mix for why. I'm just thinking like the members' perspectives too,
like people still in the church today or back then
who are practicing polygamy. Like I feel like they'd be like, well, it was the doctrine, you know, but there's definitely like that little, yeah, but I gotta do this. But I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. And I feel like a lot of people outside the church are like, it's hard to comprehend like why on earth people would do that. Like if it's not about like the sex seems like the obvious answer. Like if it's not about that, what is it about? And that's like what the church is saying is like, it's about like being obedient and like and they say different things too, like taking care of these women. Like if men were married to these women, they're part of their household and they could take care of them better, especially as they crossed the plains and like developed Utah as a wilderness into a population. Like they could take care of them better. But also there is a big argument saying like, well, that was just the celestial law of marriage that was revealed by God, is that you need to be sealed together. And so it's important that women are sealed to men who are worthy of the priesthood. Otherwise, they're going to miss out on blessings in the afterlife. And it also Brigham Young, there's a lot of instances of Brigham Young saying this to women to convince them to marry him, is like, you will be my goddess in the afterlife. You will have people who love you and serve you, and we will be gods and goddesses together in the afterlife. And it's interesting because like thinking about that, you'd think people wouldn't like, it'd be like, no, thank you. But it actually did have a very strong hold on people back then. Like a lot of women wanted that.
Well, they were really concerned about their salvation.
Yes.
And what was gonna, especially since this life was so freaking hard as was.
It was a really hard life for them.
I feel like they were living for the afterlife, and I feel like even just religiously, that's how a lot of people live anyway.
For sure.
You're living for your salvation. And plus, honestly, I'm like, what would be the selling points for me as a woman? I'm like, dang, if I had somebody helping me with household chores,
right,
I'd be okay with that.
And taking care of me and protecting me.
Yeah.
And even some of the women who left other husbands, like some of them were not good relationships. You know, like back then marriage was not like always love matches.
Right.
And so a lot of these women did not have good relationships with their husbands. Some of them like drank a lot, or some of them like, we don't know all the details of it, but we do know that case happened a lot. And so
they're like finding like sanctuary and
they're trying to find something better than what they had, you know? So it is really interesting to think about their mindset and why they did it. And the cool thing is there's a lot of records that we'll get into about women writing about it. Yeah. So for me, though, it was super troubling trying to figure all this out. And for the longest time, I tried to like find evidence to show that polygamy was right and good, even though it just sat wrong with me for so long. I really believed, and I still do believe in the church, but I really believe like that saying, like, a prophet can never lead the church astray. Like, that's something that's said a lot in the church. So I was like, I just feel like polygamy was wrong and bad, and I don't see any like true goodness or principle-based thought behind it. And so eventually I just came to the conclusion that it's kind of funny, but that God killed Joseph Smith. Like, God's hand was in his murder, because I was like, I think Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet, because I don't think you can actually do this. I think it's priestcraft to say you're doing something for God and then be doing something evil instead. And to me, like, I looked at all of it, and everything I looked at, I tried to see, like, find something that made polygamy right and good, and I could never find that. But I also couldn't, like, it all seemed like everything pointed to, like, yeah, Joseph Smith did do all those things. And so I was like, I think it happened near the end of his life. Like, the revelation came 1843, July 1843, and then he got killed. He got murdered in June 1844. So I was like, I think God had had enough, and I think Joseph Smith still brought a lot of the goodness, a lot of the truth of the church, and then he strayed and God killed him. And so that was my belief for a really long time. And that gave me a lot more peace.
Yeah.
It allowed me to deal with, like, the dissonance of the two truths of, like, I think the church is good and true, and I think polygamy is, like, everything that I look like. It doesn't seem morally right. So
But then how did you explain Brigham Young to yourself? Just curious.
I don't know. I think so much emphasis was put on Joseph Smith, since he's the one who translated the Book of Mormon. He's the one who started the church. He's the one who started polygamy. Like, I think once I got to that conclusion,
And you're like, he's the one who started it, so he bears most of the
blame. And honestly, that's what a lot of, like, I read the CES letter, which is like an anti-Mormon. Like, I don't know if they would classify themselves as anti-Mormon, but just like something going against the church narrative. And all of that focuses a lot on Joseph Smith. And it also has stuff about Brigham Young. So I think I just thought, like, oh, Joseph Smith led the church astray. And so for a little while, like, because of Joseph Smith's sins, the church it stayed in the church for a while.
Yeah.
But, like, now it's gone. Like, God eventually self-corrected and fixed the church, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think that's what I thought about. I think especially because there was so much emphasis put on Joseph Smith with everything, all the things against the church that I was reading, that did give me a lot of peace, and that's what I needed for a while. And so I was good with that belief. But then I just casually, like, I was still really interested in it. And so I would casually, like, find primary sources or, like, look into things, like, studied it every once in a while, what was happening back then. And the peace went away, and it started not to feel good again because of what I was finding. It didn't add up. Like, that even my narrative, which I know is very much not according to the church, and obviously not according to people outside of the church, even that narrative didn't make sense with the historical information. And that's what we're going to talk about in coming episodes, is, like, what is in the history truly. And we're not just going to tell you, we're going to show you the sources and, like, talk about the nuances and the context and things like that, so you know for yourself too. But just a couple things that I found that made me change my mind. For instance, Section 132, which is what we talked about this whole time, the revelation given to Joseph Smith, was never publicly revealed to the church officially until 1852, 8 years after Joseph Smith was already dead. So Joseph Smith never...
Suspicious.
Yeah, Joseph Smith never revealed that to anyone in his lifetime. It came 8 years. It was discovered, quote unquote, after Joseph Smith had died, 8 years later, by Brigham Young in Utah. But it could be, like, someone could easily explain that way, being like, well, yeah, it's because it was illegal and he was hiding from Emma. Like, that is the narrative. Like, he was keeping it on the DL publicly and teaching it privately. But the other piece of this is that Section 132 replaced Section 101 in D&C. Section 101 was endorsed by Joseph Smith during his life, and it was called the Statement on Marriage, and it stated very explicitly that marriage should only be monogamous and that they should be public feasts as opposed to the secret marriages that were happening with polygamy, and that marriage should only be between one man and one woman. So that's what was in D&C when Joseph Smith was alive. and that's what he endorsed. And then 8 years after his death, it was replaced by Section 132, which was announced by Brigham Young. So that seemed a little bit weird to me. And then some other things that didn't quite add up.
What was it replaced with?
Section 132.
Which is
the revelation saying that
for polygamy.
That's still in the scriptures
That's
today.
so weird. Like, why would you make a statement saying that marriage is this just to have it replaced like that?
Right.
Like, I feel like that's such an oddly specific thing to put in there too. I don't know, just...
It is. It's like, why would Joseph Smith put in a statement of marriage saying, it's like specifically clarifying that marriage is only between one man and one woman, and then...
Which I feel like it's like, that was the norm in the 1800s anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know.
It was, for sure. And so it is like, why would he do that? And also, even the Book of Mormon talks about monogamy. Like, you think of all the prophets in the Book of Mormon, do they have plural wives? None of them do. They're all monogamous.
As opposed to the Bible.
But that's the funny thing. In the Book of Mormon, they talk about people. There's people like King David and King Solomon, who did take on like tons of wives and tons of concubines. But the Book of Mormon addresses that and says that they were wicked and evil for doing that. And it also talks about like King Noah and Abinadi. And King Noah and his priests took on concubines and wives. And were they the good guys in that story, or were they the villains? They were the villains.
Interesting.
So it's like, why would Joseph Smith make a statement? Why would he like translate the Book of Mormon and have this all in there? If he really, like, don't you think he'd want to plant the seeds of polygamy in the book?
Yeah.
If, you know... Or like, if you're coming at it like, well, it wasn't Joseph Smith, it was God. It's like, well, if God allowed this, wouldn't he have more things in the Book of Mormon saying polygamy was okay? Or like having polygamous prophets in the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
But there isn't any. So that was really weird. Other things that are really weird is Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and many other of the prominent men who practiced polygamy after Joseph Smith died were secretly practicing polygamy in times that predated when Joseph was supposedly teaching it. So they were doing it before Joseph Smith supposedly told people. And then another thing I found interesting, and we'll go over the sources, but every firsthand account we have of Emma Smith, of Joseph Smith, and Hiram Smith is of them denying and condemning polygamy, and anyone who would teach it in public or private. They specifically say that. So
that's wild.
It's crazy.
It's wild that the church says that, yeah, polygamy was a thing, but then you're saying that the firsthand accounts are like, no.
Yeah, that's the thing. But the funny thing is, this conversation was happening back then. This argument about polygamy and who was doing what and was it right or not.
Yeah. And
so that's why, like, there are tons of accounts saying that Joseph Smith did practice polygamy and that he was lying to Emma. And people like Oliver Cowdery, like people who were close to Joseph Smith, William Clayton, obviously Brigham Young, like people like that, they were all saying, oh no, Joseph was straight up practicing polygamy. We have lots of those kind of accounts.
Yeah.
But that's from other people, you know, like that's a different source. And so
it's like, isn't he a prophet? Aren't you getting the word of God directly from his mouth?
Yeah.
And if he's saying something different, I don't know.
Right.
It's just interesting.
It is suspicious and it doesn't quite add up and it does require further review because back then and now people are saying different things about what happened and who did what. But it's just interesting that the key people who everyone is talking about, Joseph Smith, Emma Smith, Hiram Smith, they always denied it. Every writing we have from them, writings from other people, not the case. Writings from them always denied it and said it was bad. But we do know people were practicing polygamy back then. Like someone was practicing polygamy, otherwise it wouldn't be sparking this discussion.
They had a little polygamy Cupid going around. Sorry.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I'm struck.
I wonder if it was going on, well, maybe you know this, if it was going on outside of the Mormon community.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. There were some communities who influenced certain people.
Okay.
Another big thing that was interesting was there are records of Brigham Young rewriting the history of the church after Joseph Smith died to put himself in a position of power and solidify the story that Joseph Smith started polygamy instead of him. And he was joined in these efforts by people like John Taylor, Heber Street Kimball, Wilford Woodruff, Joseph F. Smith, and people like that. And another thing is, a lot of these sources from other people who say that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy that seem a little bit off is there was tons of women who said they were plural wives of Joseph Smith back then. But these documents of these people saying that, these women saying these things, they were not contemporary to when Joseph Smith died or recently after he passed. These affidavits were written 20, 40 years after Joseph Smith had died. It only, that's the records. They're still, pretty far away from the events when they actually took place. And so it's what motivated them? Why don't we have any records that happened at the same time? And we do have records, but not the affidavits of women till 20 to 40 years later. And then as you dive into the affidavits by the women, they contradict themselves. They contradict historical facts that we can verify. And also, a lot of these women, not a lot, but a good handful of women claimed that they had kids with Joseph Smith. Their children came from Joseph Smith when they were polygamous with him. But that's another crazy thing is there has been genetic testing done on people who have claimed this. And every single genetic test that was done on people who claimed they were descendants of Joseph Smith from polygamy have all turned out to be negative.
What?
Yes.
That's crazy.
Yes. And there's so many more that we are going to get into episode by episode to kind of show the actual history and to show what these arguments are being based on. But these are some of the things that were whoa, maybe this isn't what I've been told it is or what I think it is, and requires further investigation. So we're going to dive into it together to show you the documents, the witnesses, the historical evidence, and the true side of this history and the story that has been hidden for almost 200 years. So, yeah, looking forward to it, and we'll talk more next time.
Hey.